so I think we should start. Well, good evening, good afternoon, and perhaps even good morning to everybody. I welcome you in the name of the Junior Market Labs team to our today's online talk on the future of work. My name is Marianne Schoerling, and I'm leading the engagement of stakeholders at the Geneva Market Labs and will be your moderator for this 60-minute session. First, a big thank you to all of you joining us, and as well bringing life and reflection into our think and do tank that aims for accelerating towards and progress towards a sustainable future for all. Now, taking advantage of being such a diverse and large group, and I expect that we will be growing over the next 60 minutes, I invite every one of you to help us to better understand your thematic interest and to see how we could collaborate with you in the future. And for this reason, we have put together really a mini survey that takes about 3 minutes, doesn't take a lot of time. You find the link in the chat box, and we would really appreciate if you could engage with us in this matter. Because diversity, interdisciplinary collaboration is part of our DNA. We really aim for covering topics in our webinars that allow conversations across countries, across sectors, and across professions. We will continue our thought leaders conversation from last week around responses to the global storm, which we are facing, not only due to the challenge related to the pandemic and the economic downturn, but also to the challenge to meet sustainability goals. Now, it's out of question, we are facing many bottlenecks or even setbacks, which have and will have significant impact on our workforce. But the big question that we will ask tonight is, what can we do alongside different stakeholders, alongside policymakers, business leaders to prepare for the labor market challenges ahead? In fact, the future of work is a priority that we have covered already in the past, and we have focused quite a bit on responses in high-income countries. But what about the impact of global crisis on developing economies and their workforce? And that brings us to our agenda. And I asked Renata to show the slide with our agenda. Thank you. Now, our first speaker will be Sabina Dewan. We're really pleased that you could join us tonight. It's pretty late already where you are right now in India. Sabina is the president and executive director of JustJobs Network, which she co-founded with John Podesta in 2013. Sabina has built in the JustJobs Network an innovative international think tank focusing on strategies to create more and better employment worldwide. She was a senior fellow and director for international economic policy at the Center for American Progress for 6 years. And Sabina research focuses on the role of quality employment in building equitable economies around the globe. And she has published really interesting publications on the range of economic issues, from the impact of trade and globalization on employment to the nexus of renewable energy and job creation. As I said, she's based in India and will speak about the effects of global economic downturn on emerging markets. Our second speaker will be Ekkehard Ernst, who is the chief of the macroeconomic policy unit at the International Labour Organization here in Geneva. Ekkehard will share some broader thoughts on what the future of work will look like in terms of job types, skill demand, the role of artificial intelligence, and the ways we might be collaborating tomorrow. And I will share a bit more about his background before his presentation. Now, both speakers, this is our normal setup, will have 10 minutes for the presentation, and we will then have around 30 minutes for an open discussion. And my colleague, Daniel Samaan, also an economist, like Ekkehard, will lead us through the Q&A session. As a gentle reminder, please make use of the chat and post your questions already when our speakers present, but also during the Q&A session. Now, Sabina, I'm sure many of us have questions. What is or will be the impact of the current storm on the workforce? And how can we equip the workforce with the latest skills? These are very difficult questions, yet they are absolutely necessary to be looked at if we want resilient societies. And now, Sabina, we are all looking forward to your thoughts, and I'm handing over to you.
Great. Um, Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Marianne, for that excellent introduction. And I'm very grateful to Geneva Macro Labs for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to have you all in my home in New Delhi at the moment. So I think, I think this is a really important time in sort of the human trajectory. And I think I'd like to start by, I'm going to switch over to a presentation, but I just want to start by saying that, I think that many of the trends that we will continue to see, many of the trends that we've been seeing over the last couple of decades, we will continue to see in a post-COVID world. But the biggest change is really going to be a massive acceleration of the trends that we've already seen. And I think this is certainly going to be true for the developing world as well. If you just give me a second, Marianne, I'll just switch to my presentation. There, can you all see my presentation?
Yes, we can do. You can go. Yeah, perfect.
Wonderful. So let me start just by telling you a little bit about the JustJobs Network. Since 2013, my organization, which is an applied research organization, has been working with policymakers, private sector, and grassroots organizations to really find evidence-based solutions to one of the most pressing challenges of our time, which is how do you harness the productive potential of people to build better livelihoods, economic security, and more inclusive economies. And here's the key, in a rapidly transforming world. So we have now for several decades been seeing massive transformations, not least of which have been in the world of work. These include several transformations like migration, urbanization, but the ones that I'm going to focus on very quickly are technology, the restructuring of trade into value chains, and climate change. And in particular, how this current response to the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic is going to accelerate some of these trends. So I always like to say that technology is the new globalization. So taking technology first, I think technology is very clearly upending the way that we live and work faster than the ability of institutions to keep up with the pace and scale of the change. And this is certainly true for developing economies that tend to have weaker institutions. There are several questions that we have in the developing world about, what will the impact of automation be? Will developing economies be able to participate in a knowledge-based economy and leverage their sort of service-oriented growth to be able to benefit from building a knowledge economy? Will technology bring the kinds of promised productivity gains that will allow the developing countries to leapfrog in terms of their development trajectories? And I'm of the mind that we have to approach a lot of these issues with a significant amount of caution. I think the ability of developing economies to actually leverage the benefits of technology are significantly constrained by, among others, three major factors. One is the poor quality of education and skills in many of the developing world countries. The other is inequities in access to technology and weak public institutions. Now, one might ask, I go back to this slide because I wanted to explain the heading of my slide here is that technology is the new globalization. If we look at how, when through the 90s and the first decade of the new millennium, the globalization offered a tremendous amount of promise in terms of catapulting significant numbers of people out of poverty. We saw this happen in China. We've seen it happen in India. We've seen several countries around the world leverage integration into global value chains to really grow their economies. However, actually having those benefits trickle down to more of their citizens, more of their workers that actually power their economies was a little bit more restrained. And now, in some sense, we're starting to see, or have been seeing, for the last several years, some of the exacerbating effects of globalization on exacerbating effects on inequality, a rise in inequality. We've started to see sort of cracks in both multilateral and national level institutions and the ability to redistribute the gains from globalization, but also looking back, thinking through sort of what are the choices that were made in promoting a more open, integrated global economy. From the beginning, we saw a lot of capital-intensive growth that wasn't conducive to job creation in a lot of developing countries. And so from the beginning, had we thought through some of these constraints that particularly countries in the global south would experience, we might have been able to harness the benefits of globalization in a more effective manner. And I feel very strongly that we're looking at the same kinds of prospects with technology. So technology certainly has a lot of benefits to offer in terms of potential rises in productivity, in terms of particularly in a post-pandemic age where we're seeing everything from, an expansion of online learning to governments leveraging various kinds of apps to do contact tracing, direct benefit transfers, so the proliferation and acceleration of technological change. But unless we're actually able to manage that change, we may not be able to bend that arc of the change toward benefiting larger shares of the populations in developing countries in a more equitable and sustainable and effective manner. And three of the major constraints are, again, to emphasize education and skills, poor quality of education and skills, inequities in access, and weak public institutions. I think, if we think about the future of work, there was a great deal of conjecture whether automation would take place at a much slower pace in developing economies that have an abundance of low-cost labor. But what we are seeing in a number of countries is that automation is actually happening. And I think that the COVID crisis is in a way revealing the vulnerabilities of working with other humans. The idea of social distancing, the idea that human-based supply chains are particularly vulnerable. If I take India, what's happening in India as an example, migrant labor has basically left the cities and gone back to rural areas, which has left a lot of the industrial areas without workers. So even as the country is emerging out of the lockdown, supply chains are extremely disrupted because there aren't enough workers to actually power the factories to make things. And these are the kinds of, I think, potential shocks that might lead to different structures in global value chains, and I'll talk about that again. But I think what we're seeing now is an acceleration in automation, but also, as the vulnerabilities of a human workforce become more apparent, this might actually accelerate the automation trend. I also think, and of course I should preface all of this by saying is that we don't have data at this point. So this is really conjecture based on, and speculation based on the work that the research that we've been doing so far, and the trends that we've observed, and building on this theory that these trends are likely to accelerate. I think in a post-COVID world, we may see an expansion of gig work, particularly as in the developing world, a lot of the businesses are unregistered, informal businesses that tend to be very small. And here, it's certainly true of many countries in Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa. And what COVID is doing is various degrees of lockdown in different countries have actually really sent shockwaves through the small business world. And a lot of brick and mortar businesses are closing down. And again, social distancing is giving, in some countries, in some developing countries, a new impetus to delivery services. And this may all lead to a serious expansion of gig work. But as we know, as the potential for employment in certain other sectors declines, you might see a growing surplus of labor in the gig economy, which whenever there's a surplus of labor in any particular one sector, it tends to depress wages and working conditions. And so my fear is that in much of the developing world, as other sources of work become more constrained, we might actually see an uptick in gig work, but an overabundance of labor in gig work could actually depress wages and working conditions. I've already spoken a little bit about value chains. So I spoke about how the potential for the potential recognition of the vulnerabilities of relying on a human workforce could actually lead to greater automation. But I also think that with the various degrees of lockdowns and the complete shutdown of international travel and closed borders, what we've seen is shocks to global value chains that I think could lead to different trends in the future, like a greater vertical integration of value chains and potential shortening of value chains. And this has very significant implications for developing countries that have long relied on labor-intensive manufacturing for their growth and development. And so if this starts to happen, what does it mean? What do these countries then have to do in order to grow? And as I mentioned, one of the big constraints in developing countries is a lack of investment or a lack of availability of good quality education and skills, but also social protection systems that I think do not make for a lack of investments in human capital that do not make for are not conducive to a knowledge economy to fill this kind of gap. So I think one of the big questions that's confronting developing economies is what their development trajectories looks like going forward. And the last point I'll make is just about the greater consolidation of the greater consolidation of power and the asymmetries of power with a few key private sector players. This is certainly true both in the technological world as well as in the value chain world, where in value chains we had already seen that over the last several decades, as production chains became more and more fragmented, transactions were happening through the private law of contracts between private entities as opposed to between governments. And that means that the regulations now have to look very different in a 21st century post-COVID world, where a lot of the smaller businesses might go out of business, and bigger entities, there'll be a greater consolidation, which also then makes them more powerful. And the same is true for several, I think, technology companies. Finally, I'll just end on a note about climate change very quickly. I think, it's interesting in a post-COVID world when we think about I don't think there's enough discussion on the nexus of climate change and livelihoods and the potential impact that climate change can have on livelihoods. Many of us, or actually very few of us, could have foreseen the massive lockdown and the massive impact of the pandemic on livelihoods across the globe, and certainly the numbers that we're seeing in developing countries that don't have the institutions or the fiscal space to actually provide the needed relief measures in a post-pandemic world. Climate change could very well pose similar or even worse challenges. And I think the question is, will the pandemic drain resources where there's little fiscal space to actually address climate change? Or will the crisis provide renewed impetus to try to stave off future shocks? And I think that this idea that somehow progress on climate and economic activity are trade-offs is deeply problematic. And we've all seen these videos of animals roaming free because now there hasn't been any traffic, and and there's less pollution. I certainly live in a city where the pollution levels dropped significantly because of the lockdown. But this idea that somehow we have to shut down all economic activity to get healthy, to be able to breathe clean air, actually reinforces this perception of a trade-off between climate and economic activity that could actually prove to be even more problematic going forward. So I've posed a lot of more questions than answers. And in a way, I think it would be interesting to hear what your participants have to say and to engage in a conversation. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Sabina. This was excellent, and I am sure everybody, we have now 66 participants, has enjoyed listening to you. You have explained really well why technology is the new globalization, and that we can see some trends there. We need to keep in mind that a guiding principle should be how is change translating into constraints for broader populations, and not just those who have benefited in the past of globalization. So thank you for your input, and I'm pretty sure that we will have a vibrant discussion later on. But before we do so, we go now to our next speaker, which is Ekkehard Ernst. Ekkehard, you can already prepare your presentation. I will quickly introduce Ekkehard, and then we will hear his input. Ekkehard Ernst, as I've said, is a macroeconomist at the International Labour Organization, where he analyzes the impact of technological change and macro policies on productivity, employment, wages, and inequality. So there is this similar focus like that of Sabina's research. His current focus lies on understanding trends in the future of work. And together with his team, he analyzes how AI, artificial intelligence, demographic shifts, globalization, climate change, and political vagaries might unfold in the world of work. So again, quite a complex view, a macro view on the tomorrow of work. Ekkehard, we are now looking forward to your presentation, how accelerating automation, increasing economic and social disparities, and the current storm will affect jobs, working conditions, and living standards from a macro perspective. One can wonder, can we be hopeful for a more inclusive future? Ekkehard, what would you say?
Well, I think, thank you very much, first of all, Marianne, and I think the future is the future we want, as we would say at the International Labour Organization. It's not something that happens upon us, it's something that we can shape and co-shape. So I think that's maybe a positive message right from the beginning to all of you, and thanks also for having me tonight. I should add as a disclaimer, tonight I'm really talking here on as an official from the International Labour Organization. It's really stick closely to the messages that we have been presenting and that I have helped shaping together with my team. Daniel is in the call, and Rosanna Merola in this discussion. So the problem is sitting with Sabina on the same panel is always challenging because we rarely disagree. And so what I decided tonight is to focus maybe specifically on the role of artificial intelligence in terms of the in its impact on the future of work and what I call tomorrow at work. And so I think that Sabina posed the right question, which is to say that is technological change actually accelerating post-COVID? And from all we know, we would say yes, it is. It will accelerate. I mean, we have seen it after the last global financial crisis. If anybody still remembers the kind of cell phones we were running around in 2006, 2007, you see how much change has already happened over the last 10, 15 years. And so that's certainly happening again. But I think the Stilbert comment here really poses the right question, which is to say, maybe the jobs that disappear with this new technological change is any one of the jobs that we wanted to do to begin with. So maybe these some people have called it bullshit jobs. I come back to that notions. Are jobs that we don't want to have to begin with. And I think that some of the message that we have been putting forward at the ILO as well is to say that yes, there is potential for the automation to actually improve, to help us make our jobs better, make us more enrich our jobs. The examples I always give is for instance, a medical doctor who has much more possibilities now to actually help patients. Sabina comes from India. So in India, there is actually AI being used, or digital technologies being used in health centers, which help doctors to be much more effective in terms of reaching out to a larger community. So maybe indeed there is a potential not only for pessimism but even for optimism. Now the challenge is that AI targets as a very specific type of activities, and I've listed some of them here. It's a list of activities taken from a working paper from a PhD candidate in Stanford. He went to all the patents that are posted for around AI in the US and looked at what kind of skills are involved with that. And interestingly enough, most of the skills that are targeted with AI are skills related to high-skilled professions. But people like researchers, people like accountants, people who need actually at least a bachelor degree. And so the question then is, well, maybe then there is really the reason to be scared about AI, and maybe there is really something where we have seen automation in the past that has wiped out a large chunk of blue collar workers. Maybe now the next wave of automation we see is the ones for white collar workers that is coming next. So there's clearly that risk. My argument, at which I will develop further, is to say that yes, that is a possibility, but what we also will see is we will see a certain type of bullshit jobs coming back, a certain types of bad jobs coming back, but we also have the possibility with the right policies to address that. So why do I say that bullshit jobs actually might come back? And here I would say I have a slight disagreement with Sabina in terms of the gig economy. I don't think that the gig economy is really that particular of an issue. We haven't seen much of an uptake in advanced economies. Here, this is on the right side. You see figures from the US. So that was before the COVID crisis, but even after the crisis, actually a lot of gig work has disappeared. Uber has shed a lot of workers. If you look at some online labor indexes, they have also declined. So that is probably not where most of the action happens, and partly, or most specifically, because a lot of the gig work is very specific tasks that you cannot necessarily not every job can be dissected into micro tasks as the ones that are being carried out over the platform. But what will probably happen is a lot of compliance jobs that will increase. I mean, we see, and this is the chart in the middle, we see in US healthcare, the share of compliance workers has increased. You can actually draw a straight line, and you will see similar issues similar increases in occupation in other countries as well. And so this type of jobs, personal services, again, not necessarily a work that is particularly maybe it's not a bullshit job, but it's not necessarily something that is particularly comes with high working conditions or good working condition. A lot of admin jobs will appear. So probably not all of these jobs can possibly be automatized, even though AI will become increasingly better. But the complexity of our economic system is such that this type of compliance job and admin job will increase further. So what does it mean in the end? What it actually means is that we shouldn't be so much worried about the number of jobs that will disappear. These, I mean, in the past at least, and here I like this chart because I think it really tells a compelling stories. If you look at the technological progress, if you measure the technological progress by the fall in computing prices on the blue dashed line, you see that there was a massive decline over the last 30, 40 years, and certainly that continues despite Moore's law and whatever you can invent. There will be acceleration in the way we automatize, the way we kind of train our artificial intelligence tools. At the same time, and that's what you can see with the red line, the number of jobs that are being destroyed, so this is not the unemployment rate, it's the job destruction rate in OECD countries has also declined. There are many factors behind this decline, but certainly it's not the technological change that would explain that. It's not the technological change that change or the acceleration in technological change that can explain a decline in job destruction rate. So what actually did increase, and I think that's the key message of this chart, what did increase is income inequality. In income inequality, not necessarily measured in terms of wage differentials between capital and labor, but also wage differences between those at the bottom of the wage distribution and those at the top. We see executive pay has increased dramatically. It might change temporarily with the COVID crisis, but certainly not permanently. And part of the reason is that the digital economy that lies behind artificial intelligence is such an attractive force of profit accumulation that it will contribute further to an increase in inequality. So what we really should be concerned is, how do we make sure that all these benefits, the potential benefits that we can get from artificial intelligence can actually be shared across a wider range of the population. Also because we are obviously concerned with political economy issues related to a rise of populism, increase in trade barriers, etc. So there is a genuine interest in limiting income inequality, that in particular the one that is driven by artificial intelligence or by the digital economy more broadly. So at the ILO, we have been thinking about a couple of, or more than a couple, actually several policy responses to it. I won't list them all. There are many more than would fit on the chart. I think that the first three are quite standard. We need to find a way to tax this digital economy. There is discussion already going on. The OECD is preparing a plan for digital taxation. We also need, in this particular instance, we need to make sure that developing countries where a lot of data is generated are actually benefiting from these digital taxation agreements. So that's, I think that's a key challenge as well. We need to find new ways of providing social security, and not only increasing the replacement rate, but actually bringing in new people that are currently not being covered. And there, obviously, the gig economy is one specific example that we need to look at. ILO is always very keen on pushing forward the message that we need to strengthen social dialogue. So profit sharing and wage negotiation need to be brought into that picture. And I think that I would certainly agree with that message. That is something that we need to bring in. But I would add to these three elements two that are more let's say more innovative. They are being discussed, but they're not concrete policy proposals. And I think that needs to be discussed. One of the things is that it will be challenging to tax the digital economy. What we will need to do is, however, we need to find a way to tap into that resource that data is providing. Privately provided data is an enormous resource for public policymakers and for fiscal authorities. So one of the possibilities is similar to an oil fund. You actually have a sovereign data wealth fund where you also kind of invest into some of these companies that use this data and ensure that you have a wider range of constituents that can benefit from that. And I think the last point, and this brings me a bit to also to the discussion that Sabina was mentioning, is what we have seen with this crisis in particular. We have discussed this already with the global financial crisis, but what we have seen with this particular is there is actually no trade-off between resilience and efficiency. We need to strengthen the resilience of our system. That has something to do with climate change. That also has something to do with preparing better for health-related crises like the pandemic that we're currently seeing. And so AI, in a sense, can help us to better prepare for this type of events. It can have early warning signals. It can help us to identify possible threats before they come out. We have done an enormous. We made enormous progress in terms of financial market stability, and you can see that right now the benefits from all the measures that have been implemented after the global financial crisis. We should use these insights, the creation of buffers, the creation of more resilient systems, also for healthcare, also for climate action. And I think that is one kind of key message where I believe that AI can actually contribute enormously to improve our well-being, not only in advanced economies, but also in developing countries. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Ekkehard. That was very precise and condensed. And even though you said it's not that easy for you to complement Sabina's presentation, as you have a lot of common beliefs. I can see that you nicely built on what Sabina has said in terms of the trends ahead of us and how we can respond to it, in particular as it comes to policy responses. So thank you both for your presentation. What we are going now to do is we will start our Q&A session. I can see a couple of you already posted some questions in the chat. Daniel Samaan, as Ekkehard said, is a colleague of Ekkehard at the ILO, and he's an economist, and he will guide us now through the Q&A session, and I will hand over to you, Daniel.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much, Marianne, and thank you very much to our two presenters. We have already a couple of questions. I would ask you to put additional questions in the chat board. I would also give you the opportunity to ask the questions yourself, as long as we don't have too many questions. I'll start with the first question myself, and then I would like Sachin Kumar to ask his question on institutions, and then after that Faisal Rahman had a question on education system. So if you're in the call, I'll let you speak after myself. The first question I have goes actually to both of you, to Ekkehard and to Sabina. I would be interested in which sectors you see job creation and job losses, given these megatrends, technology, and also now with the COVID pandemic. I would have thought that, for example, tourism and service sectors are sectors where we see many more jobs in the future, but with COVID, this may not be the case. And I would like to link that question also to another question that somebody had, who said, with the oversupply of labor in India, how are you going to deal with automation? And I think this is also related to the question of job creation. Sabina, may I ask you to start? What sectors, where do you see the future jobs in India, and where do you see the jobs being lost?
Thank you, Daniel, for those excellent questions, and to the participants for excellent questions. I think in answering that question, it also gives me an opportunity to pick up on a couple of points that Ekkehard made, which were the points of difference between our perspectives. So the first is with regards to the gig economy. And as I said, I do think that the gig economy is a space where we're going to see jobs expand. And, you know, when I'm talking about the gig economy, I'm not just speaking about labor platforms. I'm also talking about, you know, Amazon and logistics and Dunzo and various other kinds of platform economy businesses that are capitalizing on the current moment and are likely to see a growth. So to pick up Ekkehard's point really quick, I think that the important thing about the gig economy is we have to start from the fact that we don't actually have data that can tell us exactly what the size of the platform economy is in developing economies. So let's just put that out on the table. Having said that, we do know that there's been a proliferation of platform economy businesses, and that we are seeing more and more workers enroll in various kinds of platform economy businesses. And I think that this exponential growth of the gig economy, particularly in a post-COVID world, is something to watch out for. And I do think that there is going to be limited demand in a post-COVID economy, right? People are losing their jobs right now. They're several across the globe. We're seeing, as I said, small businesses fold. We're seeing people, massive rates of unemployment. And I think as we see the impact of these job losses and businesses, constrained businesses sort of capping wages, I think we're going to see a huge decline in aggregate demand. And that aggregate demand, the limited aggregate demand, coupled with the fear of you know, going out in public places and social distancing, I think is going to reinforce the importance of the gig economy. So that's one answer to your question. I also think that it's important to bring up the issue of the servicification of manufacturing activity, right? So, of course, I think manufacturing is going to take a hit, but what we have seen is what little manufacturing activity there has been in different developing countries around the world, there's also been an accompanying servicification. And coupled with technology, this means that you're going to see a lot more logistics that's sort of automated, sorry, not automated, but that's platform-based now. And again, I think that that's going to be something to watch. I mean, I think the other really important trend, rather than which specific sectors, because I think that will vary for different developing economies. But I think the important thing here is to point out that at this point, governments are really going to have to push labor-intensive manufacturing through very strong industrial policies in developing countries. Maybe industrial policy is considered a bad word or bad phrase in some parts of the world, but I think developing countries are going to have to make a choice to really focus on labor-intensive manufacturing. I think, using labor in sectors like infrastructure development is going to be important. I think investing in particular kinds of food processing sector that bridges sort of agriculture and manufacturing activity, but it's going to have to take a conscious effort on part of governments to invest in these particular sectors rather than capital intensive sectors in a post-COVID world. And of course, I mean, in India, I mean, the scale of the employment challenge in India post-COVID is extremely daunting. And there's just no way to sugarcoat the kind of pain that this economy is going to face. We were already seeing a downward trend in several of the employment indicators prior to the crisis. And now I think we're going to definitely see that exacerbated manyfold. So again, it's going to have to be government policies like those of you that are familiar with the employment guarantee scheme in rural India. It's going to take significant amounts of, investment by governments, relief measures, active labor market policies, things like Manrega, the employment guarantee scheme, to actually harness the productive potential to people when the formal economy and the formal sectors, traditional sectors, are just not going to be producing enough jobs, particularly in India. That's case in point. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Sabina. Ekkehard, any thoughts about the situation in advanced economies? You also think the government needs to maybe slow down automation to have more labor employed? What do you think?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would agree with Sabina. I think that we haven't seen the scale of the jobs crisis yet. I mean, that I would say that we are still seeing many more job losses to come, partly because a lot of businesses are still surviving at the edge, but most likely will run out of funds by the end of the year. So I think that there's certainly a crisis in the making, and that's not me saying it at ILO. That's something that you can read in the press. You see already the crisis coming, because somehow the funds, the support funds, will run out very shortly as soon as the crisis measures, the confinement measures, are being lifted. So I think that's and for that purpose, obviously, governments need to step in and provide support for aggregate demand. Now, there's different ways of doing this, and I would agree with Sabina. You can either kind of spread out helicopter money. That's one way of doing it, and certainly is important in terms of addressing the uncertainty that comes with it. But I think in addition to that, you also need to target labor-intensive sectors. Now, I wouldn't go as far and say, well, we need to have industrial policies, because I think there is obvious examples of labor-intensive sectors, which is infrastructure. We have huge backlogs of infrastructure, including in advanced economies. If you look at the numbers for Germany, I just looked at some of the IMF publications recently. If you look at the numbers for Germany, it's mind-boggling how much public capital has declined over the last 10, 15 years. Huh? You need people in education. You need people building new roads, new electricity networks, etc. These are labor-intensive services or utilities, and I think that maybe not everything can be done immediately, but I think that there's a huge backlog, and that would for developing countries would also provide not only jobs, but in addition possibilities for upgrading, for technological upgrading. I think that if you want to have labor-intensive manufacturing, or you want to slow down automation in developing countries, my fear would be developing countries are losing out for economic integration in the international economy. Simply because, and there's a very simple argument behind this, that if you cannot provide quality at the level that is being required for your for advanced economies, you will not be part of a supply chain from developing countries. That's just simply not possible. You will supply to your local market. Maybe India is big enough for that, I agree, but for many other developing countries, the local markets are just too small to be able to develop a manufacturing sector just for their local constituents, and we have tried that in the past and it didn't work. So I would actually be very cautious to say, well, let's build up labor-intensive manufacturing and let's get rid of automation in these sectors, because I don't think it will work as a sustainable strategy in the long term.
Yeah, thanks, Ekkehard. There were some questions about institutions and the role of institutions in these transformations. Sachin Kumar, do you want to pose the question yourself? Can you unmute yourself and ask your question? If you're still...
Yeah, basically Sabina discussed about, rather pointed out about the weak public institutions. So I'll be happy if she could elaborate a bit on that.
Sabina.
Thank you, Daniel. I think with regards to, first with regards to slowing down automation and promoting labor-intensive manufacturing, I think that if you look at the literature on automation, there's ways to adopt automation in a way that's labor augmenting as opposed to labor displacing necessarily. But that again involves extensive investments in building up human capital, both in terms of education and skills, but also in terms of investing in social protection so that you can harness the productive potential of your workforce. And I think that's an important point to make, because it's not, you know, investing in labor-intensive manufacturing is not a monolith, right? There's different industries that automate at different paces, at different levels, and in different ways. So I think when we talk about an industrial policy, or we talk about labor-intensive manufacturing, I think we need to be a little bit even more detailed and to kind of map out how and what the potential of automation looks like and what impact that will have. But in the short run, I just don't see any other way out. I mentioned infrastructure, and I agree with Ekkehard. I mentioned that, and Ekkehard emphasized the importance of infrastructure, but infrastructure also demands a huge amount of investment, and land. And, you know, isn't always the best quality job. So, I mean, my point with all of this is the fact that it needs to be regulated. All of this needs to be, it's not about more or less regulation, but well regulated, so that we can harness the benefits of technology, so that we can harness the benefits of labor-intensive manufacturing and make clear choices about how we create jobs and how we create good jobs for our people, rather than saying, let's grow first and think about the benefits and redistribute the benefits later. Now, of course, all of this takes, the really important thing is that it takes strong institutions. And what do I mean by strong institutions? Well, for one, I think there needs to be more technical assistance for a lot of government officials to understand the impact that these transformations are having on their labor markets and their economies. The second is, I think, in this realm of sort of education, we need to understand that we're no longer able to use a neoliberal paradigm strictly in a 21st century economy. Dichotomies of informality and formality, trade-offs between resilience and efficiency no longer apply in a 21st century economy. So when I'm talking about institutions, I'm talking about the capacity of public officials and government officials to understand the sort of changes that are taking place in their economies. I'm talking about the fiscal space and fiscal planning that goes into being able to provide the kinds of investments in human capital, education, health, and so on that we need, and to strengthen the regimes that help pay for it, right? So whether that's taxation policy and holding private sector players accountable to ensure that the responsibility for protection of workers, building human capital is spread across different players. So a kind of a broader definition of what I mean by institutions. Thank you.
Sorry, can I just add something to that? Because I mean, so, yeah, no, I mean, I perfectly agree with what you were saying, Sabina, and I think that's an excellent point. I would add to that, and I said this in particular because I see Prakash Lungani is also on the call, is that we do also need a new consensus at the international level of what we want to achieve and how we want to play these different institutions, how do we want to bring them together. I know that the IMF is doing a lot of work to try to kind of find a way of integrating issues related to labor and inequality into their macro framework, and I think we maybe want to forge a new consensus at the international level, because that would stimulate also the policy debate at different national levels. And I think specifically in terms of what you mentioned yourself, there is no trade-off between resilience and efficiency. It goes together, and I think finding a way of expressing this as a new, let's say, a new Delhi consensus, if you so want, then I think that would be something that we can forge at the international level to stimulate policy debates at the national level.
Okay, thank you. Since you singled out Prakash, maybe Prakash, you want to ask your question on the role of the left, I may say, and maybe we can link that also with a question that Michele raised, you know, what the role of the unions is. Before I go back to Faisal, who is bringing us to institutions and education. Prakash, would you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Okay. Actually, I have a question about.
Okay, Faisal first. Okay, fine.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. I want to ask to the panelists, especially about the low education of workers. How you guys deal with this condition? Because if you want to talk about the transformation, you have to consider about the education first, and then you have to deal about you say that there is labor intensive or capital intensive, so there is any benefit and cost about labor or capital intensive. How you guys deal the human well-being? That's enough.
Okay, so can we maybe collect a few questions? So we have one on the role of the education systems, and then Prakash, you want to pose your question as well? And then we hand over back to the panelists.
Yeah, thanks very much. These were great presentations. I guess this is more for Ekkehard, for advanced economies. I mean, it seems to me that some of the changes that you folks are advocating would not come about unless the center-left parties in the US and in Europe actually represent their base constituencies. They seem to be taken over by the neoliberal agenda and in the pockets of the rich. Do you agree, or do you think that's too stark and provocative?
Well, maybe I wouldn't formulate it like this, although I might agree with you, but I think, and I want to combine this with an answer to Faisal. If you see where the Social Democrats in Germany came from, they came from a desire to educate their members. There was the agenda of the Social Democrats in the 19th century was exactly that. How do we improve our working condition by making sure that our members have better access to education? And so I think, indeed, what we need to know is we need to do more is that social, or the left, if you want, needs to focus more on its own constituents by, in particular, focusing, and I think Sabina alluded to this as well, is focusing not so much on redistribution. That is certainly an important element to it, but on primary distribution, on working conditions, on wages, on how to strengthen labor market institutions, including how to strengthen social protection system. And I think that is something where the left, at least in some European countries, I don't think that's true for all, in some European countries and in the US, maybe have left a bit their original constituents in favor of some other people that may not be a sufficient number to kind of help them winning the votes.
Thanks.
Okay, Sabina, do you want to pick up the question on education and education systems and what can be done to, increase the skills of the workforce? And then after that, I can maybe pick one more question before we have to close down.
Yeah. So very quickly, I think with regards to education and skills, I think the first important thing is that there was this global push to really expand enrollment in education, and we've seen that bear fruit significantly with a number of countries achieving almost 100% enrollment, very close to 100% enrollment levels in the primary and secondary level education. We've also seen a great degree of growing gender parity in primary and secondary education. So those have been some huge strides in education, but where perhaps I think a lot of countries have dropped the ball is in actually ensuring that enrollment comes with an expansion and improvement in the quality of education. And so I think that it's certainly in many countries it's about an expansion in spending, but I also think that it's a shift in the emphasis in existing education systems. And there's a lot of global best practices. I mean, if we look at, for example, South Korea and their sort of trajectory of investing in education, and how they invested very heavily both in kind but also in quality and how that served them, I think there's several other examples that can be drawn upon in terms of best practices for improving education systems. The second point that I really want to underscore is this idea that you can take a 2-month, 3-month, even a year-long skills training program and assume that somehow that can compensate for years of poor quality education. There's a massive push on part of almost every developing country, as well as most multilateral institutions that are pushing skills. And I personally find that to be deeply problematic, because what you actually see is that a lot of these skills training systems aren't actually aligned with market demand, and that if people don't have the foundational requisite levels of education, then skills training gives them no economic mobility. And so I think that that's a second point that I wanted to make. And the third is just that a lot of skills training systems in the developing countries that we've looked at have been very much supply driven. So they have, a lot of developing countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, have a very large and growing youth population, and under pressure to give their young people something to do, governments are pushing skills training. But if that skills training doesn't actually translate into a job or doesn't actually translate into a wage premium of any kind, then actually what you end up with is a bunch of very frustrated youth that don't find jobs. And so, and so that becomes really problematic. And I think we need to actually start thinking more about apprenticeships. We need to start thinking more about on-the-job training. We need to start thinking more about requisite levels of education and thinking about education and skills as one continuum as opposed to silos. Thanks.
Thanks, Sabina. Maybe I can pick up on that last point, and I hope our audience doesn't mind if we, are maybe 2 minutes over, so we can maybe ask one more question. I'm trying to summarize a little bit the questions that I have seen. and I would ask the two speakers to be very brief. So there have been some questions actually exactly on that, on career opportunities for young people. Somebody said, I am an urban planner in India, I have a master's degree. So the education is already there. You know, what is the advice for these people, you know, with COVID and with automation? Would they, how likely is it that it's not a question of better education, but there are maybe not just enough jobs? Maybe Ekkehard and Sabina, you can make a very short statement on that, and then I would give the floor back to Marianne, who can have will give us the final words. Ekkehard, you want to start?
Yeah. Thanks, Daniel. I mean, I agree. I think this is really challenging times right now for young people, and especially for those millennials who already have suffered from a first crisis during the global financial crisis. They're suffering again now through this COVID crisis. This is indeed a challenge. What I cannot provide an individual career advice here, but what I would say is that you definitely need to look into what is the particular competences that you have learned in your studies and how can they be applied maybe in sectors outside where your dream opportunity or your dream job is. I mean, this is a very generic advice, I know, but it's something that I think what we also see in terms of career advice right now in advanced economies, what people will tell you basically. I wanted to just add to what Sabina was saying, is I perfectly agree with the fact that we need to focus more on vocational and technical education. I think that's an issue, and that's something that the ILO has been driving quite a bit in the past. And it will involve or needs to involve social partners to bring in the competence profile and the definition of what these competence profile look like, including in the informal economy. I would add to that, it doesn't have to be necessarily formal education. There are good examples in Nigeria, in other countries in West Africa, of good informal vocational education systems. We need to scale these systems up. We need to find ways of making sure that the systems work in such a way that young people have an opportunities to market these skills also in a wider context, not only in their original place where they're coming from. So I think that there are examples where this type of training system exists, not only in the formal economy, but also in the informal one, and where we actually can maybe find ways in engaging with the informal economy there and promoting this type of approaches at a larger base. Because clearly, supply-driven education is not sufficient to address the demands that these countries have.
Yeah, thanks, Ekkehard. Sabina, maybe very briefly, because we're already over the time. What's your view?
Yeah, no, I would agree with everything that Ekkehard just said, but I'll just underscore 3 things very quickly. I think when it comes to education and skills, it's not just any one problem. It's the fact that it's supply driven. It's the fact that there's a massive mismatch between what businesses want and say they want and what systems are geared toward. It's a product of the fact that things are changing much faster than again, the ability of institutions to keep up, which I said in my presentation, and then just, you know, having to rethink the quality and the content of our education and skill systems and thinking of it as a continuum. I think all of this is part of the problem. So to this gentleman who asked the question, it's not, you know, it's not just because you have a high degree of education but are having trouble finding employment that the entire system is that way. In fact, I think the system is broken because of a confluence of several different related problems, of which yours is one. And you know, I'd be happy to. I live in India. Happy to have a chat with you offline and see if I could help in any way.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to both of our panelists. Thank you very much for your very active participation, and sorry that we cannot go through all the questions. I would like to add that we have a YouTube channel, so there is a possibility to review this whole webinar, and you have the possibility to also raise your questions in the comment section. And we are also working on a tool that in the future we can continue the discussion over the chat. So if your question has not been answered, please still, stay engaged with us, get in contact with us, and talk to us in the future. And I would like to hand back to Marianne. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. And also thank you to you, Sabina and Ekkehard. You've done really a great job to pick really up the critical questions that we wanted to answer tonight. And also thank you, Daniel, that you pointed out our YouTube channel, which will help us to continue the discussion. Now, I would like to add that we need a new social contract in order to pave the way for a system that foresees the competences that are needed in the future. And I really want to highlight what Ekkehard was saying, that the supply-driven trajectory of jobs might not be the one we want to choose for the future. Now, having said this, taking a positive and a proactive approach to shaping the future of work will enable business, will enable us to respond to desire of income security, well-being, empowerment. And as we continue our series webinar, I would just like to highlight the two upcoming webinars that we have in the month of July. Until the month of July, before the summer break. We will finish on the 15th of July with the webinars, and then we'll continue later on. Now, next week, we have the pleasure to discuss with Robert Ward from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the IISS, and Professor Marina Kruseva from the Wiesbaden Business School, political risks due to the pandemic and possible future scenarios. And the week after, again on Wednesday, Gianfranco Moore from the state of Geneva and Pascal Eichenberger, president of the platform ALP ICT, to promote digital innovation for SMEs in Switzerland. They will talk about how the pandemic, how the virus is shaping our digital future, and that will kind of overlap maybe as well with our discussion tonight as we touched on automation. You will find all the events listed on our website. The list of the wonderful. The list is outlined here of how you can get in touch with us. We highlight at the end of every webinar that we are looking forward to your feedback. Please fill out the survey that we distributed tonight through the link, and leave comments, questions on the YouTube channel, and thank you for sharing your feedback. Great, so I wish you all a wonderful rest of the week and hope to welcome many of you in our upcoming webinars. Have a good evening or good afternoon.